Well, for the next few weeks, as we're in this Christmas season, I want us to spend some time kind of reflecting on what it meant that Jesus came, right? That he came into this world to live with us, to die for us. And especially as we think about Jesus, we remember that he came as a servant. He came as a servant. Even though he's a king, the King of Kings, he came to serve us. I want you to imagine this morning that there was a nation that sent one of their leaders to visit our country. And maybe it's one of their heads of state or a foreign dignitary, and they came to build relations with our country and to learn more about our nation. And you would imagine they would come with a motorcade, with armed security, surrounded by cameras and press, and dressed to their finest with this large delegation. But imagine that this dignitary, they came and they said, you know what, we don't want to just meet the powerful and mighty in your culture. We want to see what it's really like to be an American, right? To experience the true America. And so this head of state says, I want to live with real Americans. And so instead of staying at a 4-star hotel or dining in the finest of restaurants, they go into a person's home, maybe a regular middle-class family in the suburbs of Ohio. And they go and they stay in their guest room or their basement, and they spend time with their family. The family pulls out some old comforters, maybe an air mattress, some old worn sheets, and allows this dignitary to sleep in their basement. And they share together a dinner of casserole and mashed potatoes. And after dinner, they sit on the couch and they watch football together. Right? Just imagine that picture in your mind and what that would be like. Right? We would think that would be pretty strange, maybe a weird juxtaposition of two different people or groups of people. But as we think about this picture, this just gives us a small glimpse into what Jesus did when he came to this earth, what we call the incarnation. That Jesus stepped out of heaven and walked among us and walked into our world. And this morning, as we look at John chapter 1, let's turn there in our Bibles, and let's look at how John describes the incarnation, the coming of Jesus. Let's turn in our Bibles, John chapter 1. Okay, follow along as I read. John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of a human decision or husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. This morning I want to think about that verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, what does it mean that Jesus came to dwell with us? We see here in the first chapter of John a description of Jesus as the Logos. The Logos. This is the Greek word for the Word. And it's more than just talking about Scripture or the written word, but it's a description of Jesus as the sum of all knowledge and wisdom. And here these verses describe Jesus as the light of the world, the creator of all. And it reminds us of where Jesus came from, that Jesus stepped out of heaven, paradise, perfection, out of glory, out of perfect union with God, that Jesus was the source of all creation, the light of the world, and the King of kings and Lord of lords. But this verse tells us also that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, that Jesus himself came and stepped into this world in the flesh of a human being, a man, just like we are. And Luke chapter 2 describes Jesus' birth. It says, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. I think we've probably all heard this passage many times, Luke chapter 2, how Jesus came and was born in a manger because there was no room for them to stay. But sometimes it's easy for us to just, have this picture in our minds of what that was like. But to think about it a little bit more, what is it like when a king is born in this world today? I think back to 2013, the birth of Prince George, the second in line for the future title of the King of England. Right? His father is the prince. And this made news all around the world when Prince George was born. There's a 62-gun salute fired outside of the Tower of London. 7 million people watched on TV at this moment when the parents stepped out of the hospital to bring the baby home. It was reported that just in England, there was over $300 million spent on parties and decorations celebrating the birth of King George. And this news was just spread through almost every headline and newspaper all around the world. And in this picture, you can see the hospital where Prince George was born. It's one of the best hospitals in England, if not the whole world. It's the highest standard of service and care there. And I was kind of reading how there's a trend nowadays, especially for people who are maybe celebrities or very wealthy, to have their babies born in these luxury maternity wards. And this is kind of, maybe not one of the most luxurious ones, but kind of a modern luxury maternity wards. For example, Mount Sinai Hospital in New York offers deluxe rooms overlooking Central Park with stunning views. It offers private nursing, a midwifery program, newborn photo sessions, massage therapy, and other benefits both mothers and babies in this exclusive atmosphere. Another hospital, also in England, called the Portland Hospital in London, says it offers a luxurious experience, much like the finest of hotel services. 24-hour room service, high-end toiletries, personal shoppers, fine dining, even the indulgences of champagne and oysters for the parents. Right? And the cost for one night in this room is about $15,000. Right? And these luxury maternity wards have been known to cost up to $500,000 per stay for those who demand only the very best. You may have heard of some famous people using these maternity wards. And this is a kind of a popular trend now. And you would think that this is a pretty normal place for a king or a prince to be born, only the best, right? And it makes me think back to when our children were born. They were born here in Virginia Beach, both with very nice hospitals. Lydia was born in Princess Anne Hospital, which at the time was just the second year after it was built. So it was like very new, sparkling, beautiful hospital. But even in the most normal, typical hospitals here in the U.S., typically have 24-hour care, modern medicine and medical procedures, typically very clean, modern technology, free Wi-Fi, TV, cable TV, movies, unlimited. You have food brought to you. If you need attention, all you have to do is just push a button. Right? And this is kind of the basic that we would expect from a modern maternity ward. Right? And even with all that, I know that me and Judy, when we're having our children, it was still a very stressful process, right? You think about every little thing. Do we have all the right treatments, medications? Are the doctors paying attention to us? Every little thing, every moment to the smallest detail is a focus of a lot of care. because that's what we would expect from the place that we give birth. But to think about where Jesus was born, we don't know exactly that he was born in a stable or a barn or something like that, but it just tells us that he was placed in a manger, right? And what is a manger? It's a place where animals are fed, a thing that holds the food for an animal. And, maybe Jesus was surrounded by, chickens and donkeys and cows. We don't really know for sure. But we know that this was not a high-end hospital. It was not a luxury maternity ward, but it was a place where they could simply be alone, warm, and just give birth. Right? They couldn't even have a hotel or a borrowed room for Jesus to be born in, but he was simply born the only place that he could go. When we think about how babies are born, helpless and vulnerable, totally dependent on someone else for their basic needs, unable to even hold up their own heads or to wash themselves. And that's what it was like for Jesus to be born into this world, right? Stepping out of heaven into the world of humanity. I like what Christian philosopher G.K. Chesterton said. He said, "The hands that made the sun and stars were too small to reach the huge heads of the cattle." I'd imagine that, God coming to this world in human form, so small as a tiny baby. And we know that that was just the beginning of Jesus' life. Eventually he would grow from a baby to a toddler, to a teenager, to adult. Jesus had to learn to walk, to learn how to speak, to learn how to read and write, to tie his sandals, to wash his hands, to learn how to clothe himself, just like any other child growing up into adulthood. We know that when Jesus was on earth, he experienced everything that we experienced. So John 4 tells us that Jesus experienced tiredness after traveling on long journeys and ministering to people. Jesus was hungry, even especially after he fasted for 40 days. The Bible tells us he was hungry, as we would all be. When Jesus was on the cross, he said, "I am thirsty. I am thirsty." Jesus was parched. We know that Jesus had the full range of human emotional experiences. In John 11, we see that after the death of Lazarus, Jesus was so grieved that he wept. Jesus wept. Tears streamed down his face. He was brokenhearted at the loss of a close friend. In Matthew 26, as Jesus is about to go to the cross, he says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Right? Jesus was looking forward to the journey that he had on the road to the cross. And in his heart, he felt overwhelmed. He said, maybe he was wrestling. Is this too much for me to handle? And maybe he was just thinking about the burden of sin that he would have to carry, and what a burden that would be on his soul. We know that Jesus experienced disappointment, frustration, anger, loneliness. He experienced rejection. He experienced the weight of people's expectations. He experienced the fickleness of the crowds around him that one day praised him and the next day called for his execution. We know that Jesus experienced the temptation that we face each and every day, that Jesus battled against his sin of flesh, even though he was never sinned. Hebrews chapter 2 tells us that he became like us, he became like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of his people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. We see here that Jesus came to be like us, to experience life as we live each and every day. God was not just perched up in heaven looking down at us and judging us, but God came down to walk among us, to be like one of us through the person of Jesus. Even though Jesus was fully God, he was not insulated from his humanity, when instead he chose to become a man. And then sometimes we think of Jesus as like this, in this bubble, this protective bubble, sort of moving through the crowds, moving through this life, shielded from everything. But in fact, we know is the complete opposite. Jesus was in touch with the people around him. Jesus did not come riding on a chariot or surrounded by a legion of attendants. He did not come to live with the elite or the powerful, or to grow up in a palace or a mansion, but he came to normal, regular, ordinary people. He was born to a newlywed couple, maybe barely out of their teenage years. Joseph was a common laborer, and he raised Jesus in this home, his earthly family. Jesus' birth was announced to the shepherds, people who were marginalized and looked at the lowest on the social ladder. But yet they were the first to witness Jesus' birth and to worship the King. And Jesus, when he walked on this earth, he walked among all kinds of ordinary people, from slaves to religious leaders, to those who are sick, to those who are suffering, to those who are hurting, and to those who are lost. And he didn't shield himself from them, but he touched them. He spoke with them. He ate with them. He healed them with his hands. And Jesus didn't just send out a message from the sky. He didn't just broadcast his message over the airwaves or through the screens, but he talked to people. He conversed with them. He prayed for them, and he lived among them. When John tells us that Jesus became flesh and made his dwelling among us, that's what he's talking about. That Jesus lived with us, just as that dignitary would be living in our basement or sitting on our couch. Jesus didn't just drop into this world as a visitor. He didn't just stop by for a quick visit, but he stayed. He stayed. He dwelt with us. He lived with us. That's why the verse we read this morning says that Jesus was called Emmanuel, meaning God with us. God with us. Jesus did not send a representative. God did not send a delegation, but he sent his one and only Son to dwell, to live with us. And not only did Jesus live with us, but he died with us. He took our sins upon himself. He endured his body being broken, pierced, and eventually executed. Not an easy death in a modern hospital, surrounded by doctors, but a painful death, buried in a tomb carved from a cave, until finally God raised him to life and he ascended to glory. This was not a weekend trip, but this was a lifelong mission, a mission of love sent by God, carried to the very end. So I reflect on the life of Jesus. I think about this question: what if that was me? What if I was put in Jesus' shoes? Would I have made that same choice? Right? To step out of heaven and to live among humanity. Right? Knowing all that Jesus would experience, all of the pain and struggle of human life, all of the suffering and hurt that he would experience here on this earth. Would we make that same choice? Right? To step out of heaven and to walk among mankind. But we know that Jesus did, and he did so graciously. Jesus came to be near to us. He came to remind us of who God is and to show us that God is not far away, but that God is close to us. God is near to us. That Jesus walked among us. He lived as we lived, and he walked as we walked, to show us how we should walk and how we should live. And that he made a way for us so that each and every person could know God and draw close to him. One of my favorite verses in Scripture is Revelation 3:20. It says, "Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. And whoever hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with them, and that person with me." And I love this picture of Jesus knocking on the door of our hearts and our lives, wanting to draw close to us, wanting to eat with us, wanting to live with us day by day. Sometimes we forget how much God truly loves us, that he sent his son Jesus so that we could be near to him. And he calls us, he invites us day by day to draw close to him with our lives. And some people may say, Pastor Tim, Jesus doesn't feel that close sometimes. Right? Sometimes God feels so far away. But perhaps Jesus wants to remind us that we need to turn down the noise in our life. Sometimes we need to step away from the distractions all around us and just open our ears and our hearts to his voice, to the knocking on our hearts of what Jesus wants to do, that he wants to come into our lives and remind us of the God who loves us and wants to be near to us. Why did Jesus make that choice? Why did Jesus step into this world? Because of God's great love for us. Because he came to dwell among us, and he invites us to draw closer and closer to him. This morning, as we come to the Lord's Supper, I would like us to just reflect on that for a moment, of God's nearness to us, that God is not distant, far away, but that he's as close as our very own hearts, and that Jesus came to dwell in our midst, to show us the way to the Father, and to draw us closer to him. So this morning, as we prepare our hearts for the communion, let's just take a minute to bow our heads together, to reflect and to prepare, as we celebrate, as we remember what Jesus did for us, that he gave himself, that he went to the cross for us, so that we could be made right with God. Let's bow our heads together just for a moment.